Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to pick back up with another unit on ecology today. Now, you might remember from our last unit, ecology is the branch of biology that studies how organisms interact with other organisms and how organisms interact with their abiotic surroundings in the ecosystem. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started and see what we're learning about today. So what we're talking about today are food chains, food webs, and something called an energy pyramid. Now, you've probably seen food chains and food webs, but energy pyramids might be something new to this course. So I wanted to get us started by looking at a couple of food chains. So let me walk you through these two food chains. Okay, so we've got two food chains here. On the left in the green, this is a terrestrial food chain. On the right in the blue, that is a marine food chain. So what I wanted us to notice with these, we're starting at the bottom and we're working our way up. Now, even though these are in two different ecosystems, one on the land and one is in water, something that's really important for us to know is that all food chains are going to start with a producer. Now, a producer is something that can make its own food. And another word that you might see for that is an autotroph. So an autotroph, you'll see that it has that root word auto, which means self, and then troph is talking about energy. So autotrophs are organisms that can make their own energy. Most of the time, this is through photosynthesis. So at the bottom there, we've got a plant, it's doing photosynthesis, and then on the right, that is some algae that is doing photosynthesis as well. So food chains always start off with a producer, and another word for that is an autotroph. Now, everything above those producers, everything above that are going to be heterotrophs. Heterotroph is an organism that cannot make its own food and has to get its food from a different source. That's what that prefix hetero mean, is different. So they have to get their food source from somewhere else because they can't make it themselves. So you've probably seen a food chain. I just kind of wanted to walk you through that real quick, and then we're going to look at some vocabulary that'll make talking about these food chains a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and look at those. So these are some vocabulary words. I just used some of them, but I just wanted to make sure we had all of these because sometimes we use these words kind of interchangeably. So at the top there we have autotrophs. Again, another word you'll hear for that sometimes are producers. So producers and autotrophs are the same thing. What these are organisms that can produce their own food, usually through photosynthesis. About 99% of the time it's photosynthesis. Some of these producers will use a different form of chemical reaction called chemosynthesis to make food that way if they don't have access to energy from the sun. But what's really important is that autotrophs and producers, these start every food chain, and every food web is going to start off with an organism that can make its own food. Okay? An organism that cannot make its own food is called a heterotroph. And there's a lot of different words that we use to describe heterotrophs. So you might hear herbivore. Herbivore are organisms that mostly eat plants. You can have carnivores. Carnivores are organisms that mostly eat other animals. You can have omnivores. Humans are omnivores. We eat plants and animals. And then some other words you might hear for these are predators and scavengers. So predators are animals that hunt other animals, and then scavengers are animals that eat dead animals, right? All of these things, all of these words are used to describe organisms that cannot make their own food and must consume other organisms. So heterotroph there is the big umbrella term, and then all of those are words that kind of fall under that umbrella. Okay? Another word you'll hear us use a little bit this unit is a detrivore. Now, what are these? These are decomposers. So think of fungi, mushrooms, bacteria, organisms that break down dead organic material are called detrivores. And these are actually also a type of heterotroph as well. Okay, and then the last vocabulary term I wanted to talk about is something called a trophic level. So a trophic level is the position an organism has on the food chain. So whether you're at the bottom where the producers are, or you're up there at the top where the tertiary consumers are, all of those different levels are called trophic levels, and that's just your position on the food chain. Okay, so I wanted to make sure we talked about those vocabulary terms before we got into anything a little bit more difficult. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about next. Okay, so let's talk about food chains. Okay, so food chains are a more complex version of a food web. Okay, so for these food chains here, all energy in food chains ultimately come from the sun. as this energy works its way up from the food chains, most of the energy is lost. The first organism, so just going back to that first bullet point, all energy on the earth ultimately comes from the sun. That's where all of our energy is coming from, right? And this is going to start all of the food chains. Okay, so the first organism in a food chain is always a producer. Remember that producers, these are usually plants. Another name for these are autotrophs. These are organisms that can make their own food, right? They're producing something. That's why they're called producers. So at this level, this is where most of the energy and biomass out of the whole food chain is at this level. Let's just take a brief moment and talk about that word biomass. So bio, we've talked about that prefix a lot. Bio means life. And then when we're talking about mass, we're talking about how much weight or how much stuff is in that trophic level. So when we're talking about the biomass at a certain trophic level, like if we were talking about the biomass of producers, we would take up all of the producers, all of the plants, all of the grass, all of the algae, and add up their weight, and that would give us the biomass for that level. So at this first level where the producers are, there's the most energy and the most biomass at this level. Okay, so the next level up, primary consumers, okay? Primary consumers, also called herbivores like this cow here, eat producers, right? And only 10% of the energy at the producer level moves to this level. So kind of look at what this food chain's happening at the bottom. All of our energy is coming from the sun. You can see that that's where most of our energy, all of the energy is coming from, right? That arrow is really, really big. It goes to the producers. They use that energy from the sun to make carbohydrates and sugars, right? When we go to the next trophic level, you can see that that arrow is a little bit smaller, and that's supposed to represent that there's less energy moving from one trophic level to the next, right? So primary consumers, these herbivores, eat the producers. Only 10% of the energy at the producer level moves to this level. Every time you go from one trophic level to the next, 90% of the energy is lost because those organisms had to use them to survive, right? Okay, so after this cow, the next thing that's going to happen is a secondary consumer. We would call those carnivores, eat the primary consumers, and only 10% of the energy at the producer level moves onto this level. So every time we go from one trophic level to the next, the arrows are getting smaller, and this is supposed to show that we have less energy moving at each level, okay? And then that last bullet point, when drawing food chains, we use arrows to depict where the energy is going. So notice how when I drew these arrows, for example, the plant is being eaten by the cow, so we draw the arrow like that, where it's pointing from the plant to the thing that's eating it. So when we draw food chains, try to remember the direction that the arrows are going there. Okay, so that's the information about a food chain. Okay, let's go on to food webs. Okay, so food webs are a more complex version of food chains. A food web represents several intertwined food chains. Instead of being linear, where it's just showing one organism at every level, they show many diverse and complex relationships between the communities. The linkage in a food web illustrates the feeding pathways, and food webs are simplified models of real ecosystems. So where food chains are simplified food webs are still simplified models of what's really going on there in the ecosystem. These relationships are very, very complex, and it's hard to depict them in a single image. But let's take a look at this food web. Okay, so you can see that this is much more complicated than a food chain. It's not linear. It's not one organism after the next. Instead, you can see that these arrows are kind of going every which way. Now, something I do want to point out, again, notice that this food web, at the very bottom, we're starting with our producers, right? Food webs and food chains always start with the producer because they're the ones that have access to all of that energy that's coming from the sun. So all food webs and food chains are going to start with a producer. Notice that the arrows are pointing to the organism that is doing the eating. So let's look at the far right over there. You can see the geese and mute swans. They eat that vegetation, so the arrow is going from the vegetation and pointing at the geese because that's the thing that's eating it. So why would we use a food web over a food chain? Well, these just show relationships a little bit better, and I wanted to point a couple of them out. So in a food chain, you would probably miss how important this organism is to this ecosystem. This small fish, you can see it's being eaten by 3 different organisms. In a food chain, we can't really show that. So a food web gives us a better idea of what these organisms are doing. We know that this organism is very, very important to this whole ecosystem because it's being eaten by several different organisms. If you were to take this organism out, this whole ecosystem could collapse because a lot of the organisms rely on that for its main source of food. Something else you would miss in a food chain that you can find in a food web is look at this duck right here, this herbivorous duck. It's eating 2 different things, right? It's eating the submerged aquatic vegetation, but it's also eating the bivalves because both of those arrows are pointing to it. So food webs are just a little bit more complex. They show more of the relationships that are happening in an ecosystem, but they don't show all of them. One last thing I wanted to point out before we move on. Notice that at every level you have a couple of different organisms. So at this primary producer level, we've got 3 different organisms. At the herbivores, you got 4 different organisms, right? Up here in the secondary consumers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got 5 levels up here. Something that I wanted to point out is that these tertiary consumers, another word for that is the apex predators, you usually don't have a lot of those. Remember that from every level, when we move from primary to the herbivores to the primary consumers, we're losing 90% of the energy available to us every time we move up. So that means that there's always the least amount of energy and the least amount of biomass at the top because it takes a lot of organisms below them to support these apex predators. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we get into the energy pyramids here coming up next. So let's take a look at that. So energy pyramids, okay? So energy pyramids show how much energy is available at each different trophic level. Energy pyramids also show the amount of biomass at each trophic level. Energy pyramids start with producers at the bottom. As we move from one trophic level to the next, most of the energy is lost. Only 10% of the energy moves on from one trophic level to the next one. That means at every trophic level there is 10 times as much energy in the level below it. This means that there are usually a lot of a lot of producers, several primary consumers, and there will be very little of the apex predators. So let's take all that information and just look at an energy pyramid, and we'll walk through this real quickly before we wrap up for the day. So this is called an energy pyramid. The name tells you what's going on. It is a pyramid that is depicting the amount of energy in an ecosystem. Okay, what I need you to know is just like the food chains and food webs, the bottom part of this energy pyramid is always the producers or the autotrophs. You can see that this is the biggest part of the pyramid, and that's because that's where most of the energy is. Remember that all of the energy in these food chains, most of it is coming from the sun. Which of these organisms has direct access to that energy? That's the producers, because they can do photosynthesis and turn it into food. So that's where most of the energy is. Every time we move from one trophic level to the next, we're losing 90% of the energy there. Only 10% moves on. So when you look at producers to primary consumers, we've taken one of those zeros off, right? This is 10,000 kilocalories at the producers, and then at the primary consumers, we have 1,000 calories. So that means that only 10% of it has gone off, has moved on. Every time you go from one trophic level to the next, you're losing most of that energy. At the top there, you can see the apex predator, that has 1 kilocalorie, even though we started off with 10,000 kilocalories. So in an ecosystem, you usually have the most amount of producers by biomass, and then primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then those apex predators are the ones that are eating the things below it, but because it takes so much energy to support those organisms, there's usually not very many of them. So that's a typical energy pyramid for an ecosystem. So thank y'all so much for making it here today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do. Make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.